There's a huge death rate. For example, you'll see in the statistics, we have a list of everyone who served overseas between 1585 and 1594. It's a partial list, it's about 400 names. Over a third of them are dead by the middle of 1594. So there's a very high rate of mortality associated with this. A lot of it is just to do with the fact that, like most early modern bureaucratic structures, these structures are highly inefficient and open to corruption. So you're also a hostage to fortune once you become a captain. You are in a very complicated and sometimes highly detrimental financial package. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes when you become a captain. Region. We've done some presentations. David and I did one, David Bellhouse, who's doing the next database. We looked at region. And one of the things that you'll see in this database, we haven't finished the iterations. And there's going to have to be something done around location to office and people holding multiple offices at the same time. Those are things that are still open. Background. Very difficult to pinpoint background in 16th century England. Unlike some of the more hierarchical societies of the continent, particularly Spain, where you're Hidalgo or not, in England there is what Lawrence Stone called this porous lower rim. So in fact you have people moving through merchant gentry, and we see a lot of these people parlaying this through family, court, and county connections into offices in the nobility and the high nobility. So very clearly, this kind of career can pay off very well for people unless you're killed, or go broke, or fall prey to any of the many misfortunes that can happen. The first source, and I have a student in England working on these, are, I don't know how many of you have worked on early modern accounts. Is there anybody who's worked on early modern war accounts? They're horrible sources. I'm not kidding you. If you take one of the big accounts and unroll the parchment, it would be from here to the football field. It's single entry accounting. It's a joke. You have one huge part of the account called the charge, and another huge part called the discharge, and they're cast, which means they have people who are highly skilled at this who just do rolls of parchment, and at the very middle of the account, it actually says that it's the center point, and it works outward from the center. It's a cast account. It is not an audited account. It's a declared account. Declaration means the entire account had to be read out loud at the exchequer, and it would be copied down in the audit. That's where declarations and audits come from in present-day accounting. But it's not double entry. And on this, we have complete runs of personnel, but they're spliced through all of these other accounting procedures that have to be done. You get people who are on account, but then they have to account for their food, they have to account for their clothing, they have to account for over-expense and under-expense. That's why I abandoned completely the idea of working on money, because it came down to a nightmare. People suggested themselves as a really good idea. So when David Bellhouse and Mike Bauer and I got together 3-4 years ago, we realized that this is the kind of data that commended itself in what computer scientists call a one-to-many relational database. And David was instrumental in writing grants. We got a SHRF RDI and UWO Academic Fund Major Award. We purchased a web server, and we began to work on this. And this was a brutal thing to construct, and Mike will lead you through this. Brutal thing to construct, because it had to be done in assistance with computer science students. We had a very brilliant one, as my students entered data. So it was a constant conversation. So I think that's probably enough by way of introduction to history.
I can do this, since we've already talked about it. Part of the challenge of this was, as Bill's already described, there's quite a number of individuals involved. Bill had lots and lots of data. He had data on over 1,000 individuals at the time. The kind of data he had varied from individual to individual. Data in particular were particularly bad. And he was interested in other kinds of information about each individual. He's already mentioned location, but he was also interested in the family data. He was interested in the education of the individuals, and some have multiple educations and so forth. Okay. It was much difficult to analyze all of this data, and I don't know if Bill has any horror stories, But certainly looking at the volume of data, trying to do any kind of comparisons over groups, trying to group things together, look for patterns, there's just a lot of data. So anyway, we needed better ways of doing this, and that's where Bill, Dave, and I got together and started to build this database to actually capture the data in order to begin to look for things. Now, once you have data in a database, what can you do? Well, a number of things. You can begin to look for patterns and trends. Okay? As you get more and more data in, as you get more confident in the data, it now gives you a position where you can extract data, you can begin to look at blocks of things, group things. And a relational database allows you to extract things in certain combinations. And so it's a nice way of being able to pull data out. But you've got to have the data in, obviously. And then there's other kinds of approaches you can take after you extract the data to analyze the data and to begin to look for other kinds of patterns, sort of mining techniques that allow you to do that. And we've just started to be able to do that. I'll have a couple comments about that in a minute. The other thing you can do is you can look for anomalies. As I said, I'm not a historian. And as you'll see when you start to pull out the data, one of the things I can do is I can pull out data and I can create graphs. I can look at the graphs and go, yeah, that makes sense, I think. It's got data, it's got dates, and so forth. Sometimes when you look at the graph, you go, that's kind of weird looking, but maybe it's correct, maybe it's not. And then I can hand it to Bill, and Bill goes away and tries to make sense out of it. So it's a good way of looking for kinds of things, and we'll talk about some of the challenges. So basically the idea here was to be able to capture the details about the individuals, to capture details about their name, their birth, their death, education, capture details about the office. Offices were basically divided into military and civilian. We wanted to capture both kinds of offices. We needed the title of the office. We needed the start and end dates. We also wanted to be able to capture relationships, familial relationships, as well as things like sponsors. Now, the database is nowhere near complete. A lot of this data is still to come. What we've focused on mostly are birth and death of the individuals and getting the offices in along with the start and end dates of the offices. That's sort of the core of the whole sort of basic set of research questions as it centers around the military. Dates in particular turned out to be quite a challenge. Some dates don't have it all. So you don't have any information on the date. Some dates you may know it down to the nearest day. The day an individual died or took an office or something. You may also have other information which takes a date to a day, or maybe you only know it to a year. So this adds a certain level of complexity in terms of not only entering the data, because you have to be able to accommodate these different things, but you also, it adds a lot of complexity when you're doing things like computing the lifespan or computing the time in an office, because the difference then actually does cause problems. So one of the first challenges was how to accommodate these kind of dates in the database. And I'm not going to go into detail, but basically you couldn't use the date function that comes with the database because it wants a month, a day, and a year. And in some cases we didn't have that, so you needed to somehow code it. So we ended up coding that pretty explicitly. So that gets extracted out and can be extracted out, and then we'll actually have other software that will actually analyze that. So that was a common complexity. There was also some other issues in terms of trying to decide on the titles that needed to be there, because you didn't want to duplicate things and you wanted to use a standard set of titles and so forth. So the design of the database actually took probably over the course of a year. Because I would have students that would design the database or design an interface to the database without actually building the database. And then Bill would look at it and come back and go, well, that doesn't quite work right. What about this? And then we would go back and redesign and so forth. So it's a very slow iterative process in order to get it to the place where Bill was comfortable with the kind of data that was going to be collected. So that was sort of the background for the creation of the database. So we did develop a database. It did take several iterations. The database, the data collection part of it is still evolving. Ultimately, this will become fully web-based, and other individuals interested in sort of that same time period, and the military and others in that time period can actually remotely enter this stuff from wherever they are in the world. So we have a web-based interface. So